The telegram arrived at 3 in the morning. Churchill read it standing up, still in his dressing gown, a cigar burning forgotten in the ashtray beside him. He read it twice. Then he set it down very carefully, the way a man sets down something he is afraid he might otherwise throw. His private secretary, Captain Richard Jowett, watched from the doorway. He had worked for Churchill for 4 years. He had seen Churchill angry, despairing, triumphant, drunk, inspired, and furious. He had never seen this. This was something else. This was a man who had just understood something he had been refusing to understand for a very long time. Churchill picked up the telegram and read it a third time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "He means to finish us." Jowett didn't ask who. He already knew. The telegram was from Lord Halifax in Washington. Halifax was Britain's ambassador to the United States, a careful man, a measured man, a man who chose words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, precisely and with awareness of what carelessness could cost. Which was why the telegram was so alarming. Halifax had attended a private dinner at the State Department. He had sat beside an undersecretary whose name didn't matter and whose candor, loosened by 2 glasses of good American bourbon, mattered enormously. The undersecretary had said something that no American official was supposed to say out loud. He had said that when the war was won, the United States intended to ensure that the peace was organized differently than the world that had produced the war. He said that the old empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, had created the conditions for both world wars. He said that the president believed a world of free peoples and open markets was more stable than a world of imperial systems. Then he had smiled and poured himself another glass. Halifax had written everything down the moment he reached his car. Churchill read it at 3 in the morning in his dressing gown and felt something that he could only describe afterward to himself as recognition. Not surprise, recognition. As if a suspicion he had carried for years had finally decided to announce itself. Winston Churchill was 69 years old in the winter of 1944. He had been fighting for Britain his entire life. Fighting in the literal sense, in Sudan, in South Africa, on the Western Front, in his own political wilderness through the 1930s, when no one would listen, when everyone thought him hysterical and outdated, when Hitler was growing and the appeasers were feeding him, and Churchill was the one man in England who understood what was coming and could not make anyone believe it. He had been right about everything. He had paid for being right. He had watched men he respected and served with accommodate and negotiate and retreat and tell themselves it was sophisticated diplomacy. And he had screamed into the silence until the silence finally broke and the bombs began to fall on London, and suddenly everyone knew he had been right. He had saved Britain, or he had helped Britain save itself. He was never sure which. But now he sat in the center of an alliance with the most powerful nation in the world, and he was beginning to understand that the most powerful nation in the world had its own plans. Plans that did not include the British Empire surviving the peace the way it had survived the war. He thought about Roosevelt. He thought about their meetings, the warmth, the cigars and the cocktails, and the easy laughter of men who genuinely liked each other, the camaraderie of shared purpose. Was it real? Or had he been, all this time, reading a performance? He didn't know. And not knowing frightened him more than the Germans ever had. Jowett brought coffee at 4 in the morning. Churchill was already at his desk, maps spread out, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the wall, which meant he was thinking in the way that produced either his best ideas or his worst decisions, and Jowett had never been able to tell which in advance. "Get me Ismay," Churchill said. And get me the files on the Atlantic Charter." Jowett went to find General Ismay. Churchill pulled the Atlantic Charter from memory, the way he pulled most things, whole, intact, in order. August 1941, he and Roosevelt on a ship off the coast of Newfoundland. They had signed a joint declaration, 8 principles: freedom of the seas, self-determination of peoples, no territorial changes without the consent of the governed. Self-determination, that phrase. Churchill had signed it. He had stood beside Roosevelt and signed a document that said all peoples had the right to choose their own form of government. Roosevelt had meant it. Churchill had meant something slightly different by it. He had meant it for the peoples of Europe, crushed under German occupation. He had not meant it. He admitted this to himself now, honestly, in the early morning. He had not meant it for India, for Burma, for Malaya, for the hundreds of millions of people who lived inside the British Empire and who might, if given the choice, prefer not to. Roosevelt had meant it for everyone. Churchill had understood this at the time, vaguely, distantly, the way you understand a thing that is too threatening to look at directly. Now he was looking at it directly, and the mission, he realized, had 2 parts: win the war and survive the peace. He was no longer certain those 2 things were compatible. India. It always came back to India. In 1942, the Japanese were pushing through Burma. The threat to India was real. Churchill needed American support: ships, supplies, men, weapons. Roosevelt gave him the support. But Roosevelt also sent a message, a private message, not through the usual channels, delivered by Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, a man Churchill trusted and whose presence he always welcomed. Hopkins had sat across from Churchill and delivered Roosevelt's thoughts in the careful, indirect way of a man who cares about the person he is delivering bad news to. Roosevelt believed India could not continue under British control after the war. Roosevelt believed that a free India was both morally correct and strategically necessary for the stable post-war world he intended to build. Roosevelt hoped Churchill would consider a negotiated process toward Indian independence. Churchill had listened. Then Churchill had said something he rarely said. He had said nothing. Hopkins had waited. Churchill had finally spoken. He had said that India was not something he was willing to discuss as a wartime bargaining chip. He had said it calmly. He had said it finally. And in the silence that followed, something had shifted between Britain and America that never quite shifted back. Churchill had won that round, but he understood, sitting at his desk in the early morning hours of 1944, that he had won a battle inside a war he was losing. The pressure was everywhere now. It wasn't just India. It was Hong Kong, it was Malaya, it was the Dutch East Indies, where American planners were already sketching post-war maps that bore no resemblance to pre-war maps. It was the conversations at Tehran, where Churchill had sat between Roosevelt and Stalin and felt for the first time what it was like to be the smallest man in the room. Stalin understood power. Stalin had no interest in liberating empires. Stalin was building one of his own. But Roosevelt was different. Roosevelt was a Democrat and an idealist, and a man who had read Wilson and believed in Wilson's world, the world that hadn't happened after the last war, but might, this time, be made to happen. Roosevelt wanted a united nations. Roosevelt wanted free trade. Roosevelt wanted open access to all ports, all markets, all territories. No imperial preference, no British trade agreements that locked American goods out of the empire. Churchill understood what all of this added up to. Strip away the idealism, Strip away the genuine moral conviction, which Churchill believed was real. Roosevelt was not cynical. Roosevelt genuinely believed these things. Strip it all away. What was left? American industry needed markets. American banks needed access. American power needed a world organized around American principles, because American principles happened to align perfectly with American interests. Britain's empire was not just a political inconvenience to Roosevelt. It was an economic competitor, a closed market, a rival system. Churchill poured himself a whiskey, even though it was barely past 5 in the morning, and permitted himself the thought he had been refusing for 3 years. Roosevelt was not trying to harm Britain. Roosevelt was trying to build a better world. It was just that the better world he was building had no room for the British Empire in it, and Churchill could not decide which was worse. Malice he could fight. Idealism was harder. Jowett found him still at his desk when the sun came up. Churchill hadn't moved. The coffee was cold, the whiskey was gone. The maps were still spread out, still untouched. Jowett waited. Churchill said, "Do you know what the worst thing is about being an old man in a war?" Jowett said no. "You can see too much. Young men see the next battle. Old men see what the battle is for." He paused. "And sometimes seeing too much means seeing things you would rather not have seen until they are too late to change." Jowett said nothing. He had learned that Churchill's early morning soliloquies did not require responses. They required witnesses. "I have spent my life," Churchill said, "defending something that the rest of the world has decided was indefensible. I have spent my life saying the empire makes the world more stable, more connected, more ordered. I believed that. I still believe it." He stopped. "But I am beginning to understand that I am perhaps the last man who believes it, and that when the last man who believes something has gone, the thing is finished regardless of its merits." The room was quiet. Outside, London was waking up, the same London that had burned in 1940 and held and survived and refused defiantly and magnificently to become a German city. Churchill had saved London. He wasn't sure he could save the empire. He wasn't sure anymore that the empire and Britain were the same thing. That was perhaps the most frightening thought of all. He cabled Roosevelt. He spent 3 hours writing a cable that was 20 sentences long, which meant each sentence had been revised at least 4 times, and 2 versions existed for most of them, rejected on the floor, before the final draft emerged. The cable was diplomatic. It was even warm. It referenced their friendship, their shared purpose, the historic nature of what they were building together. But underneath all of it was a question. Churchill asked Roosevelt directly what he intended for India and Burma and the rest of the empire after the German surrender. He asked it plainly, without the usual circumlocution. He said he believed that honest men could discuss difficult questions between themselves without damage to the alliance. He sent it. Then he waited. The waiting was the worst part. It always was. Roosevelt replied in 4 hours. The reply was warm. It was full of affection. It referenced Newfoundland and the Atlantic Charter and the essential bond between their 2 countries. It did not answer the question. Churchill read it twice, looking for the answer between the lines. There was no answer between the lines either. Just warmth, just friendship, just the elegant, practiced deflection of a man who had been in politics longer than Churchill, which was saying something. Churchill set the reply down. He understood now. Roosevelt wasn't going to tell him. Because what Roosevelt intended was already decided. The question was only how it would unfold, and at what pace, and whether Churchill would cooperate or resist. And Roosevelt was sophisticated enough to know that he did not need Churchill's cooperation for any of it. He just needed Churchill's signature on the right documents. And Churchill had been signing them, one after another, since 1941. He didn't stop signing. That was the thing. That was the decision he made in the winter of 1944, sitting in the early morning with the cold coffee and the empty whiskey glass. He kept cooperating. He kept building the alliance. He kept going to the meetings and sitting at the tables and signing the declarations, because the alternative was worse. If Britain broke with America over the empire, if Churchill drew a line and said this far and no further, then what? The war was won with American men and American money and American ships and American planes. If the alliance fractured, the war might still be won, but Britain would finish it alone, drained and broken, and even more indebted than she already was. The empire would not survive that ending either. At least this way, Churchill reasoned, there was time, there was influence, there was a seat at the table. At the table, things could be shaped, delayed, negotiated. He was very good at tables. He had been doing it all his life, entering rooms where he had less power than the other men present, and leaving with more than anyone expected. Maybe he could do it again. Maybe he could find the words, the framings, the constructions that persuaded Roosevelt that some of this, at least, was worth preserving. He put his coat on. He walked to the cabinet room. The war was still going. There were still battles to fight. He would fight them. He would fight all of them. And somewhere in between, while no one was looking, he would fight for the thing he was afraid was already lost. Bretton Woods. July 1944. A conference in New Hampshire. 700 delegates. 3 weeks. The architecture of the post-war financial world being built in real time. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of the age, a man of extraordinary intellect and persuasive force. America sent Harry Dexter White. White had a plan. The plan created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and, most importantly, established the American dollar as the world's reserve currency. Not the pound, the dollar. Keynes argued. He proposed alternatives. He had his own system, the Bancor, a supranational currency that would not privilege any single nation. The Americans listened politely. Then they did what they intended to do from the beginning. Churchill received the Bretton Woods summary in his red box on a Tuesday evening. He read it for a long time. The pound sterling had been the currency of world trade for 100 years. The city of London had been the center of global finance for generations. British banks had financed the building of railways and ports and cities on 6 continents. Now, the dollar would do that work. Now, New York would be what London had been. It had been done politely, correctly, through negotiation and agreement. Keynes had signed. Britain had signed. Churchill had signed. He poured himself a drink. He thought about the young man he had been, charging with the cavalry at Omdurman in 1898, the empire at its zenith, the map read from Canada to South Africa, from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, the whole thing vast and permanent, and seemingly as natural as geography. He thought about how that young man would have received the news of Bretton Woods. He couldn't quite imagine it. The young man would not have been able to conceive of a world in which this was possible. Churchill was 69 years old, and he was living in that world. Yalta, February 1945. Churchill flew to the Crimea in poor health and worse weather, and sat down with Roosevelt and Stalin in a palace that had belonged to the Tsars and discussed the shape of the world that was coming. Roosevelt was not well. He was visibly diminished. He would be dead in 2 months, though no one knew that yet, though Churchill, looking at him across the table, felt something that he tried to name and could not quite name. Stalin was the same as always, patient, immovable, watching both of the Western leaders with the flat, careful attention of a man who has survived things that would have destroyed anyone else. Churchill argued for free elections in Poland. He argued for the independence of Eastern Europe. He argued for a post-war order that preserved some balance of power. Roosevelt agreed with him on most of it. Neither of them could make Stalin actually do it. Churchill understood at Yalta that the world was reorganizing around two poles and that Britain was not one of them. He was too ill to argue as well as he might have. Roosevelt was too frail to push as hard as he should have. Stalin took everything the map offered. On the flight home, Churchill was very quiet. His physician, Lord Moran, sat with him and watched and said nothing. Churchill finally spoke. "What is the use of putting up a good front if you have nothing behind it?" Moran waited. "We could not give orders in 1938. We gave orders in 1940, and it mattered. We could give orders in 1941. Now," he stopped, "now we are three, and the smallest one." He looked out the window at the cloud cover over the Mediterranean. "The Germans are beaten. The Japanese will be beaten. And when the shooting stops, we will discover how much of what we fought to save still exists." He said nothing else for a long time. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. He died in Warm Springs, Georgia, sitting for a portrait mid-afternoon. A cerebral hemorrhage. He was dead before the day was done. Churchill wept. This surprised people who only knew one version of Churchill, the iron version, the defiant version, the man who had given the war its voice. But those who knew him understood. He wept for Roosevelt. He wept for a friendship that was real, that he had sometimes doubted and never quite stopped believing in, that was now finished without the resolution he had been hoping for. He wept because Roosevelt was dead, and Churchill had been preparing for weeks for one more conversation, one final attempt to speak plainly, to say, "Franklin, we have built this alliance. We have saved the world together, or nearly saved it. Now can we save something of what Britain was?" He would never have that conversation. Harry Truman was president. Truman was not unkind. Truman was not hostile. Truman was a decent man from Missouri who had not been told half of what Roosevelt knew and who would spend the first months of his presidency learning what he had inherited. Churchill could not start over. He didn't have time. He didn't have the health. He wrote Roosevelt's family a letter. He could not quite bring himself in the letter to say what he felt. He said that a great light had gone out. He said history would remember. He said all the things you say. He did not say, "I am afraid that what he was building will outlast what I was defending, and that I suspected this, and that I made peace with it because there was no alternative, and that making peace with it is the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than any war." He signed the letter and sent it. Then he went back to work. There was always work. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health and looked out at the crowd filling Whitehall and felt something that was not quite happiness and was more than relief and was entirely beyond his ability to articulate. He had done it. Britain had done it. They had held in 1940 when no one else would, when the logic of the situation argued for accommodation, when everyone in the world except the island and its exhausted people thought it was finished. They had held. And now the bells were ringing and the crowd was cheering and Churchill waved and smiled, and it was all real, all of it. The joy was genuine. The pride was real. The relief was enormous. He went inside and sat down. Around him, his staff was celebrating. Jowett came and stood beside him. "You did it, sir." Churchill looked at him. "We did," he said. "The question now is what we've done it for." He wasn't being melancholy. He wasn't being dramatic. He was asking a real question, the way he always asked real questions, plainly, without decoration. What was the empire now? India was going. You could feel it. The pressure was too great, the movement too strong, the moral argument too clear, and even Churchill, when he was honest, understood that the moral argument was clear. He had spent his life not being honest about that particular thing. The pound was declining, the debt was enormous, Britain owed America billions. The terms of repayment were respectful but firm. The sun had not set on the empire, but you could see, if you looked carefully, where it was heading. He lost the election in July, 6 weeks after victory, 6 weeks after the balcony and the crowd and the bells. The British people voted in a general election, and they voted for Labour, for Clement Attlee, for the NHS and the welfare state and the changed world that was coming, whether Churchill approved of it or not. He was out. He had saved Britain. Britain had thanked him and moved on. He took it externally with grace. He was gracious in defeat, conceding immediately, transferring power without drama. Internally, he was devastated. He sat in his study at Chartwell in the August heat and understood that the last card he had held had been played. Without the premiership, he had no seat at the table. Without the seat, he had no influence. Without influence, he could not shape what was coming. He had believed all along that he could stay in it long enough to protect what mattered, that the force of personality, the force of argument, the force of his particular understanding of history could hold the thing together a little longer. But you cannot negotiate from a private home in Kent. You cannot shape a world from outside the room. He poured himself a drink, the good Scotch, the one he kept for important occasions. He had not intended this to be an important occasion, but here it was. India became independent in 1947. Pakistan, too. Burma followed. Ceylon. Malaya would come. The Gold Coast would come. Nigeria, Kenya, all of it, eventually, would come. Not because Roosevelt had forced it exactly, because the world that Roosevelt had built, the world of self-determination and the United Nations and the American organized economic order, made the empire impossible to maintain. Not immoral, necessarily, not illegal, simply impossible in the world as it now existed, with the forces that were now moving. Churchill had understood this before most people did, which was why he had found it so unbearable. He gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946 as a private citizen, the Iron Curtain speech. It was one of the greatest speeches of his life. He stood in an American gymnasium and told the world that the Soviet Union was building a new empire in the East and that the democracies needed to stand together against it. He was right again. He was always right at the wrong time, or the right time, or some time that history would later decide was meaningful. The speech was attacked immediately. People called him a warmonger, called him a relic, called him a man unable to let go of old rivalries. He had heard it all before. He went home and kept writing his memoirs. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, not for statesmanship, for writing. He was back as Prime Minister by then, briefly, one final time. He accomplished very little in that last term. He was too old and too ill, and the world had moved past the questions he had been built to answer. He resigned in 1955. He lived until 1965. There is a photograph from Yalta. Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin sitting together in the Crimean sun. 3 old men who between them held the fate of hundreds of millions of people. Churchill is in the middle. He is smiling. It is a real smile, not performed, not diplomatic, genuine, which is the most revealing thing about it. Because Churchill at Yalta already knew what was coming. He already knew about Bretton Woods and the dollar and the declining pound and Roosevelt's private views on India. He already understood at some deep and honest level that the world was reorganizing and that the reorganization was not going to stop, and that he was perhaps the last man standing between the old world and the new one, and the new one was winning. He knew all of that, and he was still smiling, because the man beside him was Franklin Roosevelt, who was about to die, who was already dying, who had been his partner and his adversary and his friend through the worst years of the century. And because even in the midst of everything, the losing and the maneuvering and the fear for everything he loved, Churchill understood that what they had done together was real, was enormous, was something the world would not forget. They had stopped the worst thing. The cost of stopping it was enormous. The losses were still coming, but they had stopped the worst thing. Jowett found him once, years later, after he had left office for the last time, sitting in his study at Chartwell looking at that photograph. Just sitting with it, the way you sit with something you have made your peace with, but cannot quite put down. Jowett asked if he was all right. Churchill looked up. "Do you know what the saddest thing in the world is?" he said. Jowett said he didn't. "Being right," Churchill said. "Being right about what's coming and fighting it with everything you have and losing anyway and understanding at the end that the losing was inevitable, that it was written into the thing from the beginning." He looked at the photograph. "And still believing you were right to fight it." Jowett waited. "That's the saddest thing," Churchill said. "Not the losing, the believing." He set the photograph down. He picked up his pen. He went back to work. The history of the world, he had written somewhere, is the history of men who refused to stop. He was still one of those men, even here, even now, even at the end.